My parents took the $85,000 my grandparents had saved for years for my university and spent it on a brand new car for their favorite daughter. I sued them and she told me truth. Hi Reddit. It's me, Claudia. And if there's one thing I've learned in my 27 years of life, it's that family isn't always fair. I grew up in a house where love had a price, and no matter what I did, I could never afford it. My parents, Margaret and Daniel, would swear up and down that they loved my brother and me equally, but actions speak louder than words. And their actions made one thing very clear. My younger brother, Ryan, 24 years old, was the star of the family. Ryan, the golden boy, the miracle baby, the child my parents prayed for, born after years of thinking they couldn't have another. He was special, at least in their eyes. And me, I was just there. The first attempt. The practice child before they got it right. Not that I understood any of this when I was little. Back then, I loved my baby brother more than anything. I was 3 years old when he was born, and I still remember the day my parents brought him home from the hospital. My mom knelt beside me, her face glowing with happiness, and said, "You're going to be the best big sister, Claudia," and I believed her. I really did. For years, I played the part. I helped with bedtime stories, held his hand when he was scared, gave him my favorite toys without a second thought. If he wanted the last cookie, it was his. If he wanted my seat at the dinner table, I moved. That's what big sisters did, right? But somewhere along the way, I started to notice it. First, it was little things. The way my mom's voice got softer when she spoke to Ryan. The way my dad ruffled his hair with that look of pride I had never seen directed at me. The way my accomplishments were met with distracted, "That's nice, sweetheart," while Ryan's smallest achievements were celebrated like he had just won a Nobel Prize. But birthdays made it impossible to ignore. Every year on Ryan's birthday, my parents would go all out. Expensive decorations, huge parties, custom cakes shaped like whatever he was obsessed with that year. I'm talking about rented venues, catering, magicians, entire bouncy castle setups. Mine? Store-bought cake. Hand-me-down decorations. A quiet dinner at home. I'll never forget my 11th birthday. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. Not because I expected a huge party, but because my parents had promised me something special. They had hinted at a big surprise. Something I would absolutely love. The day finally came, and I walked into the kitchen, heart pounding with excitement. The table was set with a generic supermarket cake. A few mismatched balloons floating in the corner. My parents smiled at me, and then, before I could even blow out the candles, Ryan piped up, "Why don't I get a cake too?" And guess what? My mom turned to my dad and said, "Oh, we should get one for Ryan, too. Just to keep the peace." The peace. It was my birthday. They left me sitting at the table, candle flames flickering in front of me, while they drove to the bakery to get my brother a cake on my birthday. And when they returned, Ryan's cake was bigger than mine. That was the first time I truly realized what I was up against. But it wouldn't be the last. I wish I could tell you that the favoritism in my house was subtle, that it crept in slowly like a fog. But it wasn't. It was obvious. It was loud. It was in everything my parents did. By the time I was 15, I had stopped expecting things to be fair. It wasn't about being jealous of Ryan. I loved him. I really did. But love didn't mean I was blind. I saw the way my parents treated us differently. I saw how their eyes lit up when Ryan entered the room, how their voices softened when they spoke to him, how everything, every decision, every sacrifice was made for his benefit. I told myself it didn't matter, that if I worked hard enough, I could carve out my own path. If I got good grades, if I stayed out of trouble, if I never caused any problems, then maybe, just maybe, they would finally see me. So I threw myself into school. By sophomore year, I had one goal in mind: Westbridge University. It was a prestigious school with one of the best business programs in the country. Tuition wasn't cheap, $35,000 a year, but that didn't scare me. My grandfather, Joseph, had always believed in education, and before he passed away, he made sure that both Ryan and I had a trust fund for college. That money was my safety net, my chance to build a future for myself. Or at least that's what I thought. That summer, my best friend, Monica, and I spent hours on my bedroom floor, researching colleges. She was considering nursing schools, and I was fixated on Westbridge. I printed out application deadlines, made a list of required essays, and even started drafting my personal statement. "I think you've got a real shot," Monica said, circling something on the brochure. "You have the grades. And with your grandfather's fund, money won't even be an issue." Money. I hadn't even thought about it. I turned to her. "Yeah, I should probably ask my parents how to access it." Looking back, I wonder if I had sensed something was wrong. Maybe it was the way my mom always changed the subject when college came up. Maybe it was the way my dad got strangely quiet when I talked about the future. But at the time, I brushed it off. That night at dinner, I casually brought it up. "Hey, how do I access Grandpa's college fund?" I asked, spearing a piece of chicken with my fork. "I want to start planning for tuition." Silence. My mom and dad exchanged a glance. Ryan, who was sitting across from me, didn't even look up from his plate. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. My dad cleared his throat. "About that." The way he said it, the hesitation in his voice, sent a wave of panic through me. "We had to use some of your share," my mom said, her tone breezy, like she was talking about borrowing my sweater. I set my fork down. "Some. Ryan's soccer expenses were adding up," she explained, sipping her wine. "His travel team, the private coach, the new equipment, it was all really necessary to give him a shot at scholarships. But don't worry, we'll make it up to you." I felt my hands tighten into fists under the table. "Ryan's soccer?" I turned to my dad. "How much is left?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, technically nothing." "Nothing." I stared at them, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The $60,000 Grandpa left for my education was gone. Spent. Wiped out. Meanwhile, Ryan, who was 3 years younger than me, still had his entire share untouched. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. The betrayal was too big, too overwhelming. My mind struggled to wrap around it. They had taken everything. I turned to Ryan expecting what? Guilt? Shame? A little bit of discomfort? But he just kept eating like this was normal. Like it was expected. That was the moment it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. They had always planned on doing this. Because Ryan's future mattered more than mine. I pushed my chair back and stood up, my body shaking with anger. "You stole from me." My mom sighed, rubbing her temples like I was being unreasonable. "Claudia, don't be dramatic." Dramatic. My voice rose, my chest tightening. "That money was for my education. Grandpa left it for me." "You'll get scholarships," my dad said dismissively. "It's not like you actually need it. Not like I actually needed it." I wanted to scream. Instead, I walked out, not just from the kitchen, but from any hope I had left that my parents would ever treat me as an equal. Because now I knew the truth. I would always come second to Ryan. I barely slept that night. The conversation with my parents replayed in my head over and over. I kept waiting for the anger to fade. But it didn't. If anything, it grew worse. The next morning, I went downstairs and found my mother in the kitchen. She was pouring coffee, acting like nothing had happened. I sat down across from her, waiting to see if she would acknowledge last night's conversation. She didn't. "I need the details about the trust fund," I said. She glanced at me, stirring sugar into her cup. "Why?" "I want to see the statements." She sighed like I was being difficult. "Claudia, we already explained. The money is gone. Looking at numbers won't change that." "I still want to see them." She set her spoon down. "Your father and I made a decision for the good of the family." Of course. The same excuse for everything. My father walked in, dressed for work. He greeted my mother with a kiss on the cheek, then looked at me. "We know you're upset, but we did what we had to do." I folded my arms. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" "We were going to eventually," my mother said. "But we knew you'd react like this." I wanted to keep pushing, but what was the point? They didn't feel guilty. They didn't think they had done anything wrong. I stood up and left the kitchen. At school, I told Monica everything. She was quiet for a long time before shaking her head. "You need to get out of that house." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. She was right. Over the next few weeks, I started making plans. I researched scholarships and financial aid. I met with my school counselor who helped me apply for grants. I knew I couldn't count on my parents for anything. Meanwhile, Ryan continued living his life as if nothing had happened. He got new cleats, new training gear, even a weekend trip to a soccer tournament in another state. My parents paid for all of it without hesitation. One evening, I came home and found a contract on the dining room table. My father was on the phone, speaking excitedly. My mother sat beside him, flipping through pages. "What's that?" I asked. My mother looked up, smiling. "It's a sponsorship agreement for Ryan. A talent scout saw him play last month and thinks he has real potential." I stared at her. "And how much is this going to cost?" She waved a hand. "It's an investment." Of course it was. I went upstairs, shut my door, and sat on my bed. I had been so focused on college applications that I hadn't thought about what would happen when I actually left. My parents weren't going to support me. I needed a backup plan. I started looking for jobs. A week later, I found one at a local bookstore. It didn't pay much, but it was something. I didn't tell my parents. I knew they wouldn't approve. The first paycheck felt like freedom. It wasn't a lot, but it was mine. That night, I sat in my room and wrote out a budget. Tuition was still a problem, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I would figure it out, because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that no one else was going to help me. I kept my job at the bookstore a secret for as long as I could. I worked after school and on weekends, saving every dollar. I told Monica I would move out the second I had enough for a deposit on an apartment. She offered to let me stay with her, but I didn't want to burden her family. At home, my parents barely noticed. They were too busy with Ryan. His sponsorship deal turned into bigger plans, meetings with coaches, new equipment, travel costs. Every conversation at the dinner table was about Ryan's future. If I mentioned college, my mother would nod absent-mindedly and then turn back to whatever Ryan was saying. One evening, I came home from work, tired but satisfied. I had just gotten my paycheck and was planning to open a separate bank account. I wanted to keep my money somewhere my parents couldn't touch it. I walked into the house and heard my mother and father talking in low voices in the kitchen. "Should cover the costs," my father was saying. "And you're sure she won't need it?" my mother asked. I stopped in the hallway listening. "She's getting scholarships," my father said, "and financial aid. It's not like she needs the money sitting there." I stepped into the room. "What money?" My parents turned, surprised to see me. My mother quickly forced a smile. "Claudia, we didn't hear you come in." I crossed my arms. "What money are you talking about?" My father sighed, rubbing his temple. "We were just discussing Ryan's sponsorship expenses." I looked at them, waiting. "The money in your savings account," my mother said finally. "We were thinking about using some of it for Ryan's training program." My stomach dropped. "What savings account?" My voice was tight. "The one we've been holding for you since you were little," my father said. "It's just been sitting there, Claudia. We thought. You thought you'd take it." I cut in. My mother looked offended. "That's not fair. We've always done what's best for the family." I shook my head, feeling sick. "How much is in there?" "About $8,000, my father said reluctantly. "But think about how much Ryan needs it right now. His future is at stake." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had already taken my college fund. Now they wanted to take the only money I had left. "No," I said firmly. "That money is mine." My mother scoffed. "Don't be selfish." I clenched my fists. "I've been working, saving my own money, because I knew I couldn't rely on you. And now you want to take what little I have left." "We wouldn't take all of it," my father said. "Just enough to cover Ryan's costs." I felt rage boil inside me. They hadn't even asked. They had decided because in their minds my needs were always second to Ryan's. I turned on my heel and walked upstairs. That night, I withdrew every dollar from my savings and transferred it to my new account. I wouldn't give them another cent. And after that night, I knew I couldn't stay in that house much longer. The air in the house felt different the next morning. Heavier. Like I was standing in a place that no longer belonged to me. My parents were in the kitchen, acting as if last night hadn't happened. My mother was spreading butter on toast. My father reading the news on his tablet. Ryan scrolled through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. I sat down, gripping the edge of the table. My body was tense, my mind racing. I had made a decision, and there was no turning back. "I'm moving out," I said, my voice steady. My mother's knife paused mid-spread. My father lowered his tablet. Ryan finally looked up. My mother sighed, shaking her head. "Claudia, don't be ridiculous. I'm serious." My father leaned back in his chair. "Where would you even go?" I had already planned it out. Monica's older sister had a small apartment, and she was looking for a roommate. It wasn't much, but it was mine if I wanted it. "I'll manage," I said. My mother's expression hardened. "And how exactly do you plan on paying for anything? Rent? Food? Tuition?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. They thought I had nothing. They didn't know I had already emptied my account before they could steal it from me. My father exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "You're making this into something it's not." I clenched my fists under the table. "You stole from me. We used family money for family needs," my mother said firmly. I almost laughed. Family needs. Ryan's soccer was a family need. His tournaments, his coaches, his gear, those were always urgent expenses. But my future? That was optional. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the floor. "I'm done being second place in my own family." My mother's face twisted. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Repay them?" I looked at my father, then at Ryan, who sat there, still scrolling, like none of this concerned him. He didn't have to fight for his place in this family. It had been handed to him. I turned and walked upstairs. I had no intention of staying in this house another night. I packed my bags without hesitation. Every drawer I pulled open, every item I stuffed into my suitcase felt like peeling off a layer of my past. Clothes, books, personal things, none of it really mattered. What mattered was getting out. Downstairs, I could hear my parents murmuring to each other. I knew they wouldn't believe I was serious until I walked out that door. I grabbed my backpack, my suitcase, and my savings. The last thing they hadn't stolen from me. As I stepped out of my room, Ryan appeared in the hallway, leaning casually against the wall. "You're being dramatic," he said, crossing his arms. I ignored him. "Where are you even gonna go?" "None of your business." Ryan scoffed. "You really think you're gonna survive on your own?" I met his eyes. "I've been surviving on my own in this house for years." For once, he didn't have a comeback. I pushed past him and made my way downstairs. My parents were waiting in the living room, arms crossed, expressions tight. My mother took one look at my suitcase and shook her head. "You're making a mistake," she said. "No," I corrected. "I made a mistake trusting you." My father exhaled sharply. "Claudia, let's be rational. College is expensive. You're going to need our help." "You mean I'll need my own money?" I shot back. "Oh wait. I don't have any of that anymore, thanks to you." My mother crossed her arms. "You're not taking this attitude with you. You'll come crawling back the second you realize how hard the real world is." I held her stare. "I'd rather struggle on my own than live in a house where I don't matter." She opened her mouth to argue again, but I didn't wait to hear it. I grabbed my bags, opened the door, and stepped outside. For the first time in my life I was free, or so I thought, because just when I thought my parents had done their worst, they found a way to ruin everything all over again. I didn't hear from my parents for weeks after I left. No calls, no texts, nothing. I should have felt relieved, but I knew better. My mother wasn't the type to let things go. She was waiting for the right moment, the perfect excuse to pull me back in. I focused on moving forward. I worked double shifts at the diner, stayed up late filling out scholarship applications, and counted every dollar I made. It wasn't easy, but for the first time my life was mine. I didn't know anyone anything. Then one afternoon I checked my bank account. The number on the screen made my stomach drop. $5,200 gone. First, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a banking error. But when I looked at the withdrawal details, I saw a name that made my blood run cold. Margaret Reynolds. My mother. I gripped my phone so tightly my fingers ached. That account had been in my name since I was a teenager. But my parents had opened it for me when I was a child. They must have kept themselves as co-signers. I thought I had protected myself when I transferred most of my savings, but I had left that last bit untouched, assuming they wouldn't dare touch it. I should have known better. Monica was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. When she saw my face, she frowned. What happened? I told her. My voice was tight, my hands shaking. Her eyes widened. They actually took your money? They stole from me, I said. Again. Monica sat up. You have to do something. I nodded. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to get my money back one way or another. I pulled up my mother's number and called. She answered on the second ring. Claudia, she said, her voice full of forced sweetness. It's been so long. How have you been? I cut straight to the point. You took my money. A small pause. Then she sighed. I was going to tell you. No, you weren't. Well, it's not like you were using it, she said, her voice light, like she was talking about borrowing a sweater instead of stealing thousands of dollars. I gritted my teeth. Transfer it back. Today. She laughed softly. Sweetheart, don't be so dramatic. Your father and I needed a little help with Ryan's training costs. You know how expensive these programs are. Of course, it was for Ryan. It was always for Ryan. You had no right, I said, my voice cold. Legally, we did, she said smoothly. We're co-signers. The money was in a shared account. I inhaled sharply. Then I'll take legal action. She let out a short, amused breath. You wouldn't. I felt something harden inside me. Try me. Silence. For the first time, I could tell she was actually considering the possibility that I wasn't bluffing. Finally, she sighed. Claudia, you're making this into something it's not. I'm making this into exactly what it is. You stole from me. Again. And if you don't return the money by tomorrow, I'll report the fraud. Another long silence. Then she clicked her tongue. I always knew you'd turn on us one day. I almost laughed. Turn on you? You took everything from me? And you still think you're the victim? She sighed. You've changed, Claudia. I exhaled slowly. Yeah, I have. Then I hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time after hanging up. My mother had stolen from me, again, and instead of apologizing, she made herself the victim. I shouldn't have been surprised. She and my father had spent years convincing themselves that everything they did was justified, that my needs would always come second to Ryan's. Monica leaned forward on the couch. Do you think she'll actually send the money back? I shook my head. Not unless she thinks she has to. So what's the plan? I had already made up my mind. My parents thought I was still the obedient daughter who wouldn't dare go against them. But I was done playing that role. I opened my laptop and started typing an email to the bank, formally reporting the unauthorized withdrawal. My mother had said they were co-signers, but I needed proof. If their names weren't actually on the account anymore, this was theft. I hit send and sat back, my heart racing. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the bank. The account records confirmed that while my parents had opened the account when I was a child, their co-signer status had expired when I turned 18, which meant they had no legal right to take my money. I forwarded the email to my mother with a simple message. You have 24 hours to return every cent, or I report this to the authorities. An hour later, my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. And another. I didn't answer. Finally, a text came through, we need to talk. Now, I still didn't respond. By the afternoon, another notification appeared. A bank transfer. $5,200. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was over. Or at least I thought it was. Because later that night, Monica nudged me while we sat on the couch. Claudia, she said carefully, pointing at her phone. I think you should see this. I leaned over and saw a Facebook post, my mother's. It was long, dramatic, and all lies. We raised our daughter with love, gave her everything, and this is how she repays us? She's turned her back on her family, spread cruel lies, and is now threatening legal action against her own parents. After everything we sacrificed for her, my heart is broken. We don't know what we did to deserve this. There were hundreds of comments, people sympathizing, calling me ungrateful, saying how horrible it must be to have a daughter like me. A pit formed in my stomach. She had stolen from me, lied to me, and now, when I finally stood up for myself, she was making me the villain. Monica's jaw tightened. What are you going to do? I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table. Nothing, I said, because for the first time I understood something important. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to convince anyone of the truth. I had my money back. I had my freedom. And most importantly, I had finally walked away. For good. Monica watched me carefully, waiting for me to react, but I just sat there, staring at the wall. My mother's Facebook post was spreading fast, twisting reality into something ugly, making me look like an ungrateful, spiteful daughter. People who barely knew me were commenting, offering her sympathy, calling me selfish. A few relatives had already sent me messages, demanding to know how I could do this to my own parents. Monica nudged me gently. You okay? I took a slow breath. I knew they'd try to make me the villain. I just didn't think it would happen this fast. She scoffed. You stood up for yourself. That's all it took for them to turn you into some kind of monster. I nodded. My parents had spent years controlling the narrative, making sure everyone saw them as perfect, selfless parents. And now that I had broken away, they were making sure the world saw me as the problem. Monica hesitated. Are you going to respond? I shook my head. No. She frowned. Are you sure? People are believing her. I know, I said. But if I fight back, I'm playing her game. She wants me to explode, to start a war online so she can sit back and act like the victim. Monica sighed. That's so messed up. I grabbed my phone and blocked her. Blocked my father. Blocked Ryan. Blocked every relative who had sent me nasty messages. One by one, I erased them from my life. When I was done, I set my phone down. I felt lighter. The next day, I went to work as usual. I poured coffee, took orders, and tried not to think about my mother's lies spreading across the internet. But that evening, as I was walking home, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I ignored it. Then another call. And another. I frowned and finally picked up. Hello. A familiar voice came through the line. My grandmother. Claudia, she said, her voice cautious. Are you okay? I stopped walking. My grandmother, my dad's mother, had always been quiet in family matters. She never got involved in drama, never took sides. But she also wasn't someone who called just to chat. I swallowed. Yeah, I'm fine. She was silent for a moment. Then she sighed. I saw your mother's post. I tensed. And I don't believe a word of it. I let out a shaky breath. Thank you. She hesitated. But there's something you need to know. I gripped my phone tighter. What? They're planning something, Claudia. Your parents. Your mother called me earlier, ranting about how she wasn't done with you. She wouldn't tell me what she meant, but she sounded furious. A chill ran down my spine. Of course, they wouldn't just let this go. I had won. I had my money back. But that wasn't enough for them. They wanted to make sure I paid for defying them. And I had no idea what they were planning next. I didn't sleep that night. My grandmother's warning kept running through my head. She wasn't done with me. What did that mean? What else could my parents possibly do? They had already stolen my money, dragged my name through the mud, and turned half the family against me. But I knew my mother. If she said she wasn't done, she meant it. The next morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls from an unknown number. A voicemail notification sat at the top of my screen. My stomach twisted as I hit play. Claudia. My mother's voice filled the room, dripping with false sweetness. I wanted to give you a chance to fix this before things get worse. Your father and I have been talking, and we don't think you fully understand what you've done. You've embarrassed us. You've hurt this family. And now you've forced us to take action." She paused, as if waiting for me to beg. I gripped my phone tighter. "We spoke to a lawyer," she continued. "And since you lived under our roof using our resources for 21 years, we're within our rights to demand financial compensation. If you don't want this to get ugly, I suggest you come home and talk this out." The message ended. I stared at my phone, my breath unsteady. They were suing me. Monica, who had been listening from the kitchen, practically sprinted into the room. "Are you freaking kidding me?" I shook my head, trying to process it. "They want to scare me into crawling back." She folded her arms. "Are you actually worried?" I exhaled slowly. No lawyer would take this seriously. They're bluffing. But that wasn't the point. They wanted to punish me. They wanted me to feel like I had no control. And if I didn't stand my ground, they would never stop. I opened my messages, scrolled to my mother's contact, and typed one final response. "Take me to court. I dare you." Then I blocked her number. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them anymore. They had taken everything they could from me, and I was still standing. They had lost, and I had finally won.